The air inside the crystal dining room of the Grand Regency Hotel was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib, expensive French champagne, and subtle, suffocating arrogance. Overhead, massive glass chandeliers cast a golden glow across 30 guests draped in silk, tailored tuxedos, and diamond necklaces. "Could you grab us another basket of warm sourdough rolls, sweetie?" my future mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, asked, her voice dropping into that crisp, drippingly sweet tone she reserved exclusively for people she considered lower class. She handed me her empty bread basket without looking up from her plate. "And see if you can find some extra garlic butter while you're back in the kitchen. You know how the kitchen staff operates, dear. Speak their language so they actually bring it." A ripple of quiet, polite laughter moved across the long mahogany table. My fiancé, Lieutenant Commander Blake Vance, chuckled right along with his mother, adjusting the cuffs of his sharp navy dress uniform and dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. He didn't check on me. He didn't tell his mother to stop. He just took another sip of wine, completely comfortable with the joke. I stood there in my simple navy blue dress, holding the empty wicker basket, my hands perfectly still. 8 years in the United States Army had taught me many things, but above all, it had taught me absolute emotional control under fire. I looked at my parents sitting halfway down the table. My dad, a retired auto parts machinist, was staring down at his plate, his knuckles white against his napkin. My mother, who spent 30 years working long shifts at an interstate diner, looked down at her lap, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Before I could walk toward the kitchen doors, the heavy oak entrance to the private dining hall swung wide open. 2 armed military policemen in spotless dress uniforms stepped into the room, coming to rigid attention on either side of the doorway. The conversation at the table died instantly. Glassware stopped clinking. Through the doorway stepped a broad-shouldered officer with stark white hair, wearing a dark green service dress uniform, adorned with 4 shining silver stars on each shoulder strap. General Marcus O'Connor, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, swept his gaze across the room until his eyes locked onto me. He didn't acknowledge Eleanor. He didn't look at Blake. Instead, the 4-star general walked directly toward me, stopped precisely 2 paces away, snapped his boots together, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a crisp, razor-sharp military salute. "Captain Miller," General O'Connor's deep voice boomed, cutting through the silence like a blade. "The Chief of Staff sent me personally. The President has signed the authorization, and your unit is officially cleared for the Distinguished Service Cross. We need you at the head table, ma'am. My name is Captain Evelyn Miller. I am 30 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have served as a critical care aeromedical evacuation nurse in the United States Army Medical Corps. If you've never served in military medicine, it's easy to misunderstand what we do. Most people imagine hospital wards, white coats, blood pressure cuffs, and quiet recovery rooms. But aeromedical evacuation is a completely different world. We operate in the back of vibrating, unpressurized C-130 Hercules cargo planes and Black Hawk helicopters, suspended mid-air over mountain ranges and desert valleys, stabilizing critically wounded soldiers while anti-aircraft fire rattles the airframe around us. You learn to place an IV line in total darkness while an aircraft takes hard, evasive maneuvers. You learn to calculate medication dosages in your head while blood slickens the metal deck beneath your boots. You learn to keep a dying 20-year-old soldier alive with nothing more than a headlamp, a bag of saline, and sheer determination. In that environment, titles don't matter. Prestige doesn't exist. The only thing that matters is competence, calm under extreme pressure, and loyalty to the person bleeding on the litter in front of you. I grew up in a small, working-class town in southern Ohio called Steubenville. It was the kind of town where the factory whistles marked the beginning and end of every day, where people judged your character by how clean your yard was and how hard you worked. My father was a lifelong union machinist at an auto parts stamping plant. He worked 48 hours a week for 35 years, coming home every evening smelling of machine oil, cutting fluid, and industrial metal dust. My mother worked 30 years as an evening shift waitress at a diner near the interstate exit, working 6 nights a week from 4 in the afternoon until past midnight. They were quiet, relentless people who worked constantly so that my younger brother and I would never have to worry about whether the heat would stay on in the winter or whether there would be food in the refrigerator. I remember one night when I was 16 years old, I was sitting at the kitchen table, struggling with a chemistry homework assignment, complaining about how unfair it was that my classmates had private tutors. My father walked in from his shift, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, his thick, calloused hands covered in dark grease stains that never quite washed out of his skin. He pulled up a wooden chair, set a glass of tap water on the table, and looked at me with those steady blue eyes. "Evelyn," he said, his voice deep and raspy from years of factory air. "Some people in this world wear fancy suits and talk loud to make themselves feel important. They think having money means they're better than the folks who sweep the floors or turn the wrenches. But real strength doesn't need a loudspeaker. Real strength is about how much weight you can carry for somebody else without complaining. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small because your hands are dirty from honest work." That conversation stayed with me for the rest of my life. When I turned 21, I got into a prestigious nursing program at Ohio State. But tuition was expensive, and I refused to let my parents take on debt for my education. So for 4 straight years, I put myself through nursing school by working 40 hours a week as a waitress at the exact same interstate diner where my mother worked. I wiped down laminate counters covered in spilled coffee and dried syrup. I scrubbed heavy grease traps at 2 in the morning. I carried heavy tray loads of hot dishes until my shoulders burned and my wrists throbbed. I took orders from rude, condescending customers who snapped their fingers at me, spoke to me like I was stupid, or left nickels on the table as a insult. I wasn't ashamed of it for a single second. That diner job paid for my anatomy textbooks. That job paid for my medical scrubs. That job taught me how to read people in 2 seconds flat, how to diffuse angry tempers, and how to maintain total emotional control under pressure. And most importantly, that job funded the bachelor's degree that allowed me to earn my commission as an officer in the United States Army Medical Corps. 4 years into my military service, after completing my flight nursing training at Fort Sam Houston, I was assigned to a Joint Service Logistics and Medical Readiness Conference in Norfolk, Virginia. That was where I met Blake Vance. At the time, Blake wasn't the arrogant, status-obsessed man who sat at that rehearsal dinner table. When we first started dating, he was a 32-year-old Navy lieutenant commander, smart, charismatic, handsome, and full of energy. He was serving as a tactical supply officer on a destroyer home ported in Naval Station Norfolk. He laughed easily, knew the names of the junior enlisted sailors under his command, and seemed to possess a genuine passion for naval history. When we started spending weekends together, driving down the coast to North Carolina, or exploring the quiet beaches of Virginia, I opened up to him about my family. I told him about my dad's factory shifts and my mother's decades at the diner. Blake listened intently, resting his hand on mine, nodding with apparent admiration. "I respect that so much, Evelyn," he had told me back then, looking straight into my eyes over a small wooden table at a seafood shack in Virginia Beach. "My family comes from money, but I've always believed that people who build their own path are the ones who have real substance." I fell deeply in love with him. I thought I had found a partner who shared my core values, someone who understood service, dedication, and mutual respect. But over the next 3 years, as Blake moved up the officer ranks, something inside him began to rot. He transferred out of operational sea duty and accepted a high-profile staff assignment in Washington, D.C., working in corporate liaison and naval procurement at the Navy Annex. Suddenly, his daily life no longer involved sailors, maintenance schedules, or operational readiness. His world became defense contractors, political lobbyists, high society dinner parties, and country club memberships. He began surrounding himself with people who measured human worth entirely by net worth, family pedigree, and political access. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, Blake began to change. His laughter became less genuine and more calculated. He stopped asking how my medical training was going. He started making subtle, snide remarks about my clothes, telling me I needed to shop at more expensive boutiques in Georgetown so I wouldn't look out of place when he introduced me to senior officials. And then came his family. The Vance family carried themselves like American royalty. His father, Arthur Vance, was a retired senior defense contractor executive who made millions sitting on corporate boards for aerospace firms. His mother, Eleanor Vance, was a prominent D.C. socialite whose entire existence revolved around charity galas, historical preservation boards, and keeping track of which families belonged to which elite country clubs in Maryland and Virginia. The first time Blake brought me to his parents' sprawling estate in Potomac, Maryland, a massive brick mansion with manicured lawns, iron gates, and a long circular driveway, Eleanor looked at me with open disdain. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress I had bought off the rack at a department store, and a modest silver watch my father had given me for my college graduation. Eleanor greeted me at the front entrance with a cold, superficial smile, her eyes scanning me from head to toe before offering a lukewarm hand. During dinner in their formal dining room, served by quiet staff in black aprons, Eleanor began questioning me about my background. "So, Evelyn," Eleanor said, sipping her vintage wine, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Blake tells us you're in the Army. Where does your family reside? The main line in Philadelphia? Or perhaps Greenwich?" "Neither, Mrs. Vance," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone polite and grounded. "My parents live in Steubenville, Ohio. My father is a retired machinist from an auto parts plant, and my mother worked as a waitress at a local diner for 30 years. The dining room went dead quiet. Eleanor set her gold-rimmed wine glass down on the polished mahogany table so hard the crystal hummed. Her lip curled into a delicate, practiced expression of disgust. "A waitress," Eleanor repeated, as if trying out a word from a foreign language she found foul. "How?" Blake usually brings home young women whose families have foundations, or at least a presence in regional politics. But I suppose the military is an equalizer of sorts, isn't it? Blake didn't defend me. He just cleared his throat, took a long drink of his wine, and shifted the subject to his father's recent golf trip to Hilton Head. From that night on, Eleanor made it her personal mission to remind me of where I came from. Every family holiday, every dinner party, every gathering, she would find subtle ways to drop passive-aggressive insults about my humble background and my simple tastes. But what hurt far more than Eleanor's insults was Blake's reaction to them. Instead of standing up for me, instead of shutting his mother down, Blake slowly began to adopt her mindset. He started asking me not to mention my mother's diner work around his military friends. When we attended Navy events, Blake would introduce me, but the moment someone asked what I did in the Army, Blake would quickly jump in before I could speak. "Evelyn does medical administrative coordination," he would say with a forced, breezy laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "Lots of charts, hospital supply inventory, transport paperwork, very organized stuff." He deliberately downgraded my career to a clerical desk job because he thought nursing, and especially aeromedical transport, was too blue-collar and unglamorous for his social circle. He preferred his friends to think I sat at a quiet desk in a regional office pushing papers, leaving the high-status military achievements to officers like him. What Blake didn't know, and what I couldn't tell him, was the true nature of my military service. 14 months prior to our rehearsal dinner, I had been deployed overseas on a classified assignment. I was attached to a specialized Joint Service Aeromedical Evacuation Unit operating under Joint Special Operations Command. Because the mission involved highly classified operational protocols in non-permissible airspace in the Helmand province, every member of our team was bound by strict non-disclosure agreements and Department of Defense classification protocols. I couldn't talk about the night operations. I couldn't talk about the emergency combat sorties. I couldn't tell Blake about the wounded operators we pulled out of active kill zones, while rocket-propelled grenades flashed past the open doors of our aircraft. Operational security wasn't just a military rule to me. It was a sacred oath to protect the soldiers we served. So I chose silence. I let Blake believe whatever he wanted. I let him play his social games and tell his condescending stories. I thought my patience was a sign of emotional maturity. I thought that if I just loved him enough, stayed calm enough, and endured his family's subtle snubs, the man I had fallen in love with in Norfolk would eventually return. I was wrong. Silence doesn't change an arrogant person, it only gives them permission to push harder. The rehearsal dinner took place on a crisp Friday evening in late autumn, exactly 24 hours before our scheduled wedding at the United States Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis. The venue was the private grand ballroom dining space of the Grand Regency Hotel in downtown Washington, an opulent room featuring marble pillars, crystal chandeliers, hand-woven Persian rugs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the illuminated monuments of the nation's capital. Eleanor Vance had taken complete dictatorial control of the event planning. She had spent over $40,000 on custom floral arrangements, imported French table linens, hand-calligraphed gold leaf menu cards, and a 5-course dinner with rare wine pairings. 30 guests were seated around a massive, U-shaped mahogany dining table. The attendees included senior Navy staff officers, corporate executives from Arthur Vance's defense network, D.C. political lobbyists, and members of Eleanor's elite lineage society. My parents had driven 8 long hours from Ohio in their 10-year-old sedan to be there. They sat near the middle of the long table, looking visibly overwhelmed and uncomfortable in their modest formal clothes. My father wore his one dark suit, a slightly boxy, charcoal gray suit he had bought a decade ago for my uncle's funeral, and a plain navy tie. My mother wore a modest navy dress she had carefully ironed in their $40 a night budget motel room 10 miles outside the city. From the moment the evening began, Eleanor and her inner circle treated my parents as if they were invisible service staff who had accidentally wandered into the room. During the cocktail hour preceding dinner, my father tried to engage Arthur Vance in a polite conversation about industrial supply chains, mentioning his 35 years working on automotive stamping presses. Arthur Vance didn't even turn his body to face my father. He simply looked down over the top of his reading glasses, offered a dry, single-word response. Indeed, and immediately turned his back to resume a conversation with a Navy captain about naval defense contracts. When my mother politely asked Eleanor where the wedding gift table was located so she could place a handcrafted lace tablecloth she had spent 3 months making for us, Eleanor gestured vaguely toward a dark corner near the coat rack without making eye contact, and immediately snapped her fingers at a passing hotel waiter to request another glass of champagne. I sat beside Blake at the head of the table, my chest tightening with every passing minute, my heart aching for my parents. I reached under the heavy white tablecloth and squeezed Blake's hand tightly, leaning close to him. "Blake," I whispered, keeping my voice low and composed. "Your mother and father are completely ignoring my parents. They're sitting there all by themselves. Could you please engage them? Introduce them to the captain sitting across from you?" Blake pulled his hand away from mine to adjust the gold cufflinks on his uniform shirt. He leaned in close to my ear, his tone sharp and irritated. "Evelyn, please," Blake muttered, his voice cold. "Look around the room. My parents are hosting senior naval leadership and corporate board members tonight. Your dad is trying to talk about factory shifts and industrial presses. It's just 2 different worlds. Let's not force awkward conversations. Just let it be." A cold, heavy stone settled deep in my stomach. I looked at Blake's profile, his slicked-back hair, his polished uniform, his smug smile as he turned back to joke with his Navy colleagues. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Blake wasn't oblivious to his family's cruelty. He wasn't just trying to keep the peace. He actively agreed with them. He was ashamed of my family. Halfway through the second course, a delicate wild mushroom soup, the hotel's head waiter brought out large silver baskets of warm sourdough bread for the table. As a junior waitress was setting a basket down near Eleanor, her hand slipped slightly on the polished silver tray, causing a small butter knife to drop onto the thick carpet near my feet. The young waitress, who looked to be no older than 19, went pale with panic. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she stammered, scrambling to bend down and retrieve it. "It's completely fine," I said quickly and gently, reaching down before she could stress further, picking up the knife and handing it back to her with a warm, reassuring smile. "No harm done at all. Take a breath. You're doing great." The young girl looked at me with deep gratitude, whispered a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," and moved quickly away. Eleanor watched the entire exchange from across the table. She set her soup spoon down with a soft clink, leaned across toward her husband, and spoke in a loud, theatrical whisper that carried clearly across the quiet dining hall. "Look at that, Arthur," Eleanor said, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. "You can take the girl out of the diner, but you can't take the diner out of the girl. She's still bussing tables and playing waitstaff even at her own rehearsal dinner." Several guests at the head table offered polite, quiet chuckles, covering their mouths with their napkins. Blake let out a short, uncomfortable laugh, shaking his head as he looked at his mother. "Evelyn's always had a natural knack for food service," Blake added, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, clearly attempting to play along for his mother's amusement. Before the Army gave her a clipboard to organize supplies, she spent years carrying trays of greasy food at a truck stop diner in Ohio. Old habits die hard, I guess. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly on his plate. My mother's face went completely pale, her eyes dropping down to her lap, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. The room seemed to shrink. The golden light from the chandeliers felt suddenly blinding, hot, and suffocating. I looked at Blake. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking around the table, taking in the smiles of his mother and his high society peers, basking in their approval. He had traded my dignity, and my parents' dignity, for a cheap laugh from a room full of arrogant strangers. 8 years of military service, hundreds of hours in the back of vibrating medical aircraft, holding the hands of wounded 18-year-old soldiers while blood pooled on the deck and anti-aircraft fire exploded outside the airframe. The long nights studying for my degree while my feet ached from 12-hour diner shifts. My parents' sacrifices, their decades of back-breaking manual labor to give me a future. And the man sitting next to me, the man I was supposed to marry in 24 hours, thought that entire lifetime of sacrifice was nothing more than a punchline. A profound, absolute calm washed over me. It was the exact same icy clarity that comes over a trauma nurse when a critically injured patient hits the bay doors. The emotional noise vanished, the anger cooled into pure, unbreakable resolve. I sat up completely straight, pulling my shoulders back, placing my hands flat on the white linen tablecloth. "My mother worked at that diner for 30 years, Blake," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a clear, resonant authority that cut straight through the chatter in the room. Every head at the table turned toward me. "She worked 6 nights a week, on her feet, until her knees bled," I continued, looking directly into Blake's eyes. "She paid for my medical textbooks with the tips she earned $5 at a time, and my father worked 35 years in a factory, so I could stand here today. There is more honor, more courage, and more true dignity in 1 hour of their hard work than in anything said at this table tonight." Eleanor's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of sharp, haughty outrage. She straightened her diamond necklace, gasping loudly. "Now see here, Evelyn," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising. "It was a harmless, light-hearted joke. Goodness gracious, don't be so dramatic and overly sensitive. You are causing an embarrassing scene in front of our distinguished guests." "I am not being dramatic, Eleanor," I replied, my voice steady as steel. "I am setting a boundary." Blake turned to me, his face flushing dark red with embarrassment and anger. He leaned in until his face was inches from mine, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, his voice dropping into a harsh, furious whisper. "Evelyn, shut up right now," Blake spat, his teeth clenched. "Don't you dare embarrass me in front of my command and my family. My parents paid over $40,000 for this dinner. Just sit down, take the empty bread basket to the kitchen like a team player, and stop making a fool of yourself." He reached over, grabbed the empty wicker sourdough basket from the table, and shoved it roughly into my hands. "Go ask the kitchen for warm rolls," Blake ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "And put a smile on your face while you do it." I looked down at the wicker basket in my hands. I looked at my mother, sitting down the table, tears quietly overflowing onto her cheeks. I looked at my father, whose hands were clenched into tight fists on his lap, trying so hard to maintain his composure for my sake. I slowly stood up from the mahogany table. I didn't yell. I didn't drop the basket. I held it with the exact same calm, dignified composure I had maintained through 2 deployments overseas. "I'll get the rolls, Blake," I said softly. I stepped away from the head table and walked into the broad center aisle of the ballroom, but I didn't take a single step toward the kitchen doors, because at that exact second, the heavy oak entrance doors at the front of the hall burst open with a resounding crack. The heavy oak doors hit the brass wall stops with a heavy thud that rattled the glass fixtures along the hallway. 2 tall, immaculate soldiers from the United States Army Military Police Corps, dressed in dark service greens with polished leather belts, white gloves, and dark berets, stepped through the entrance. They moved with absolute tactical precision, taking up security posts on either side of the doorway, coming to rigid attention. The casual chatter across the grand ballroom died in an instant. The soft chamber music playing in the background seemed to cut out. Guests froze with their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. Arthur Vance frowned in deep confusion, pushing his chair back slightly. Through the double doors walked a broad-shouldered senior officer. He wore the dark green service dress uniform of the Army. On his shoulder straps burned 4 polished silver stars. His uniform chest was covered in 5 thick rows of ribbon decorations, including the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. It was General Marcus O'Connor, Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Walking half a step behind him was Colonel David Vance, no relation to Blake's family, the senior Army Medical Corps liaison officer to the Pentagon. Blake's eyes widened in absolute shock. As a Navy lieutenant commander, Blake recognized 4-star rank instantly. A 4-star general is one of the highest-ranking military officers in the entire United States Armed Forces. They do not make casual, unannounced appearances at private civilian rehearsal dinners without major national cause. Blake quickly pushed his chair out, stood up straight, and adjusted his Navy uniform jacket, a eager, polished smile spreading across his face. He instantly assumed the general was a high-level official invited by his father's corporate defense contacts to surprise the family. "General, sir," Blake declared, stepping forward out of the head table area with a crisp, eager naval salute. "I am Lieutenant Commander Blake Vance, Navy Supply Corps. It is an absolute honor to have you join our rehearsal dinner, sir. My father, Arthur Vance, sits on the executive board of—" General O'Connor didn't even slow his stride. He brushed right past Blake's extended hand, as if Blake were an invisible ghost, his sharp, steel-gray eyes sweeping across the grand room until they locked directly onto me, standing in the middle aisle, holding the wicker bread basket. The general walked straight down the center carpet, stopped precisely 2 paces in front of me, snapped his boots together with a sharp crack, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a full, formal military salute. Colonel Vance, standing right beside him, executed the exact same razor-sharp salute. The dining room went dead silent. The silence was so absolute you could hear the soft humming of the air conditioning vents high above. Eleanor's mouth hung open in total disbelief. Blake stood frozen in the aisle, his arms still hanging half-raised from his ignored salute, his face turning an unsightly shade of pale gray. "Ma'am," General O'Connor said, his deep, commanding voice echoing off the marble pillars. "Captain Evelyn Miller?" I set the wicker bread basket down on a nearby side table, brought my heels together, pulled my shoulders back, and returned the salute with crisp, flawless military precision. "Yes, General," I answered, my voice clear and steady. "Captain Miller reporting, sir." "Captain," General O'Connor said, lowering his hand and looking at me with immense professional respect and warmth. "I apologize for interrupting your family gathering this evening. But 30 minutes ago, the Secretary of Defense and the Department of the Army formally declassified the operational records for Operation Silent Rescue, the high-altitude aeromedical evacuation mission you commanded in the Helmand province 14 months ago." A collective murmur moved through the military officers sitting at the surrounding tables. Operation Silent Rescue was a legendary, highly whispered-about engagement within Joint Special Operations Command, a midnight emergency mission where an unarmed medical flight crew had flown directly into a saturated enemy kill zone to pull out trapped personnel. General O'Connor drew a thick, leather-bound document case bearing the gold-embossed seal of the Department of Defense from inside his coat pocket. "For 14 months, Captain Miller," General O'Connor stated, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "you have been under strict legal prohibition from discussing the details of that engagement with anyone, including your family, your peers, and your command. You bore that heavy mantle of secrecy quietly, with total professional composure, asking for zero public credit or personal recognition." The general opened the document case, reading aloud from the official presidential citation. "On the night of September 14th, General O'Connor read, his voice strong and clear, when the primary casualty evacuation helicopter was disabled by heavy ground fire, Captain Evelyn Miller voluntarily exposed herself to intense small arms and mortar fire to secure 14 critically wounded American soldiers and civilian personnel. Despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to her shoulder, Captain Miller personally performed emergency life-saving surgical interventions mid-flight in total darkness, while maintaining patient stability during a high-risk, low-altitude extraction. The general paused, looking out over the room before returning to the text. Through her extraordinary bravery, technical expertise, and refusal to yield under fire, Captain Miller ensured that every single wounded service member survived the night. By direction of the President of the United States, Captain Evelyn Miller is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in military operations. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a soldier in the United States Army, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor itself. Silence hung heavy over the room. I turned my head slightly and saw Blake's entire world collapsing in real time. His eyes darted frantically from the four-star general to the gold-embossed presidential citation, and finally to me. The clerical administrative girl he had spent 3 years trivializing, the woman he had just ordered to run to the kitchen for bread rolls, was one of the most decorated combat medical officers in the entire United States military. Arthur Vance sat frozen in his chair, his face flushed bright red with sudden, terrifying embarrassment. Eleanor looked as if she had been hit by a tidal wave of cold water, her hand clutching her diamond necklace in horror. General O'Connor lowered the document and looked around the mahogany table, taking in the environment, the tense air, my parents sitting isolated near the middle, and Blake standing awkwardly in the aisle, looking small and foolish. "Colonel Vance," General O'Connor said quietly to the officer beside him, "why was Captain Miller standing in the aisle holding an empty bread basket when we walked in?" Colonel Vance looked directly at Blake, then at Eleanor, his face setting into a hard, unforgiving line. "Sir, it appears Lieutenant Commander Vance and his family were attempting to use the captain as waitstaff." General O'Connor's steel-gray eyes locked onto Blake like an artillery targeting system. The air in the room felt 20 degrees colder. "Lieutenant Commander Vance," General O'Connor said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly tone, "I am familiar with your service record. You hold a procurement staff billet in Washington. You have spent your entire naval career sitting behind a desk in air-conditioned command centers." Blake swallowed hard, his throat making a dry, painful clicking sound. "Sir, General, there's been a complete misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, Lieutenant Commander," General O'Connor cut in, sharp as a razor. "You stand in the presence of an Army officer who bled to save American soldiers on the battlefield, and yet you have spent this evening humiliating her, disrespecting her uniform, and treating her family like inferiors." The general turned his back on Blake completely, walking past him without another glance. He approached my parents, reaching out his hand to my father with genuine warmth. "Mr. Miller?" General O'Connor asked gently. My father stood up, his posture straight, gripping the four-star general's hand with his thick, calloused worker's hand. "Yes, sir. I'm Evelyn's father." "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller," General O'Connor said, his voice echoing with deep sincerity. "You raised an extraordinary daughter and a brilliant military officer. The United States Army and this nation owe your family a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid." My mother wiped tears from her eyes, tears of overwhelming pride, and smiled brightly, holding my father's arm. General O'Connor turned back to me, holding out the leather folder. "Captain Miller," the general said, "the official public ceremony will take place at the Pentagon next month, but the Chief of Staff wanted this document in your hands tonight. Furthermore, by direction of the Secretary of the Army, you have been selected for early promotion to the rank of Major." I accepted the folder with both hands. I looked at my parents, standing tall and proud, and then I turned to face Blake. Blake took 2 slow, shaking steps toward me, his hands trembling at his sides, his face completely pale, his voice cracking with desperation. "Evelyn," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Evelyn, please. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the classified mission. Please, let's go outside and talk about this. We're getting married tomorrow." I looked straight into Blake's eyes. For 3 years, I had held on to the hope that the kind, respectful man I met in Norfolk was still inside him. But standing there, looking at him stripped of his arrogance, exposed in front of senior military leadership and his wealthy peers, I saw the truth. He was a small, weak man who tried to elevate himself by pulling others down. I reached up with my right hand and unclasped the simple diamond engagement ring from my left ring finger. I walked over to the side table, picked up the empty wicker sourdough basket, and dropped the diamond ring right into the center of it with a soft thud. "You can keep the ring, Blake," I said, my voice perfectly clear, calm, and absolute. "And you can take the bread basket to the kitchen yourself." I turned to my parents, extending my hands to them. "Mom, Dad, let's go. I'm taking us out for the best steak dinner in Washington." My parents stood up proudly. As we walked out of the grand ballroom side by side, flanked by General O'Connor, Colonel Vance, and the military police honor guard, not a single person at the Vance table dared to say a word. 6 months have passed since that night at the Grand Regency Hotel. The fallout for Blake Vance and his family was swift, relentless, and completely devastating to their social standing. In military and defense procurement circles, news travels faster than lightning. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the story of what had transpired at the rehearsal dinner and Blake's disgraceful behavior toward a Distinguished Service Cross recipient had spread across senior Navy staff offices and defense contracting networks. On Monday morning, Blake was summoned directly to the office of his commanding admiral. While Blake had not committed a court-martial offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, his conduct had brought severe dishonor upon his command and the United States Navy. His pending assignment to an elite diplomatic liaison post in Europe was instantly cancelled. Instead, he was abruptly reassigned to an obscure, low-level logistics management desk at a remote supply facility in rural Indiana. His career trajectory was effectively frozen, ending any chance he ever had of making commander or captain. Arthur Vance faced immediate, overwhelming pushback from his corporate board members. Several retired 3-star and 4-star officers serving on the board expressed deep disgust over the family's treatment of combat medical personnel. Facing mounting public pressure and private embarrassment, Arthur was forced to quietly resign from 3 lucrative defense executive committees, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual director fees. Eleanor Vance's elevated position in Washington high society completely collapsed. The story of the Waitress daughter who held the second highest medal in the military became the main topic of conversation at every charity event, lunch gathering, and club meeting in Maryland and Virginia. Humiliated by the quiet stares and snickers of her peers, Eleanor withdrew from several prominent historical societies and charity boards, effectively isolating herself in her Potomac estate. As for my life, it unfolded in ways that felt like a fresh, clean sunrise. 3 weeks after that night, I stood in the center of the Great Hall at the Pentagon, with my parents sitting proudly in the very front row, my father wearing a sharp new tailored suit my brother and I bought him, and my mother wearing a beautiful dark blue dress. The Secretary of the Army pinned the Distinguished Service Cross onto my uniform jacket. Right beside it, they pinned the golden oak leaf insignia of a major in the United States Army Medical Corps. Following my promotion, I accepted a high-impact assignment as the Chief of Aeromedical Evacuation Operations and Leadership at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. Today, I lead a team of 70 dedicated flight nurses, combat medics, and aviation specialists, training them how to save lives under the hardest conditions imaginable. On the very first day of every training cycle I teach, I walk up to the whiteboard at the front of the auditorium and write one sentence in bold black letters. Leadership is not defined by rank, pedigree, or wealth. It is proven by how much weight you are willing to carry for the people who cannot fight for themselves. My parents still live in that small town in Ohio, but their lives are much easier now. My dad officially retired from the stamping plant 4 months ago, and my mother finally hung up her diner apron for good. I bought them a quiet 3-bedroom home sitting on 5 acres of land near a clear lake, complete with a wide front porch where my dad sits every evening watching the sunset and reading history books. On the wooden desk in my command office at Fort Liberty sits a single framed photograph. It isn't a picture of me receiving the medal from the Secretary of the Army at the Pentagon. It isn't a picture of me standing next to General O'Connor or posing with senior officers. It is a simple, slightly faded photograph taken 20 years ago behind that small interstate diner in Ohio. In the picture, my mother is wearing her white flour-dusted apron, holding a heavy tray of dishes, smiling brightly alongside a 10-year-old version of me in grass-stained sneakers. Every single morning, before I put on my Army uniform, adjust my major's insignia, and walk out to command my soldiers, I look at that photograph. It reminds me of where I came from, the true cost of honest labor, and the unbreakable dignity of a family that taught me how to stand tall no matter who tries to make me feel small. Leave the word honor in the comments right now if you believe that true human worth comes from hard work, humility, and how you treat others, never from a title, a bank account, or a fancy uniform. Real character isn't something you can buy at an expensive store or fake at a dinner party. It is forged in the quiet, honest choices you make when you think nobody important is watching. And if this story reminded you that real integrity will always outshine arrogant pride every single time, subscribe. Because tomorrow, I am telling you about a female Air Force captain who was publicly humiliated at a formal military ball by her corrupt commanding officer, only for a surprise inspection team to uncover a secret that brought down his entire command. I'll see you there.